So let's get started talking about Chapter 4. Chapter 4 in your book is titled Gross Income Exclusions. What we're going to call it is what money coming in does not get counted as earnings. First thing I want to do that I forgot to do on the last actually couple chapters, and I apologize for that, was that I told you that whenever we would start a chapter, I would show you where we were actually working on the 1040 tax return. We are down here in the income section. That's what Chapter 3 was about. We're still there for Chapter 4. So with that in mind, let's start talking about exclusions. Here's the thing to keep in mind about what money gets excluded when we're trying to figure out what earnings are. There are two things that get excluded. First one is money that was never income in the first place, and I'll explain that in just a minute. And then also income that's specifically excluded for certain reasons, and for the most part that's reasons that were determined by the IRS or the government. So with that in mind, we're going to look at what isn't income and what doesn't get counted even though it technically is income. Let's start off with what isn't income. These are the things that we count as not actually earnings. Money that you borrow. You may receive $100,000 to buy a house, but you're going to end up paying that all back. So that money coming in was never actually earnings. It was never income. It was borrowed money that had to be given back to someone. The next thing we talk about is what's called income that hasn't been realized yet. And this word realized you're going to hear a lot in your bookkeeping and accounting career. Basically what it means is you may have something that has increased in value, but you're still holding on to it as an asset. You haven't sold it yet, so you haven't realized that increase in its value. Your home, you may have paid $100,000 for your home. And then the housing market gets really hot and all the houses around you have gone up in value and now they're all worth $200,000. So theoretically, your house is now worth more. You don't have to pay taxes on the fact that it's worth more because you haven't actually sold it yet. Now, if you sold it at that point in time, the $100,000 more than what you spent on it would be considered gain. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Something else that comes up in here is what's called self-help income. And that means that you're conducting services that you may get paid for in the rest of the world, but you're doing it for yourself. So you may be a plumber that goes out and charges people to do plumbing work, but when you do plumbing for yourself, that isn't considered income for you. Kind of along those same lines is the rental value of something that's personal use. So you may own, let's say, a boat that you rent out to other people. But when you use it yourself for your personal use, then that's not going to be something that's considered income. And finally, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, when we're talking about selling something, there is a chance that you do sell it for more than what you paid for it. The amount that you paid for it is not considered earnings, but anything over that you received on the sale is considered a gain, and those gains are taxable. Okay, so that covers what isn't income. Now let's talk about what is income, but the IRS has made the decision that they're not going to consider it in your earnings. Officially, we call this the major statutory exclusions. That's what your book references it as. These are the things that the IRS, through laws, statutes, have decided that they are not going to include in your earnings. Gifts and inheritances. We talked about that in Chapter 1. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Keep in mind that you are allowed to receive a gift or inheritance up to certain amounts with certain limits. You studied that in Chapter 1. Life insurance proceeds. Now, what do I mean by proceeds? Well, keep in mind that life insurance is actually an investment tool. You can pay money into your life insurance policy, and depending on what kind of policy it is, the agreement could be with the insurance company that the more you pay into that policy, the more its value grows, and you can turn around and resell it later. Now, what we're talking about here is if you have a life insurance policy that you're going to pay on for 10 years, that is $1 million policy. Once you pay in full 10 years and it has grown and invested, it's going to be worth more than $1 million. The face value on it isn't considered earnings in any way, but if you get more money out of it than what it's worth, that extra is considered earnings. Awards for meritorious achievement. Think the Nobel Prize. If you win the Nobel Prize, there's $1 million cash prize with that. Because of these rulings by the IRS, it's okay, go ahead and win your Nobel Prize. You aren't going to have to pay income tax on it. Scholarships and fellowships. So if you receive a scholarship to go to school at Jeffco, as long as you're using that scholarship for tuition and related expenses to tuition, that isn't going to be considered earnings that you're going to have to pay income tax for. Also, along with this, we have what's called qualified tuition plans. Some of you may have benefited from this. For anyone who is planning to go to school in the future, there is a plan called a 529 plan under the IRS tax code. Once this plan has been established at a financial institution, people can make tax-deductible donations into that for you, so that whenever you get to the point where you're ready to go to school, you can then pull money out of that to use for tuition and also those other related expenses. So once you take that money back out of those qualified tuition plans, those 529 plans, that's not going to be considered income because it's been excluded by the IRS. Payments for injury or sickness. And let's talk about this for a second. If you sue someone because you've gotten hurt at their store, typically when we sue for two different amounts. One of the amounts is what we call damages, and the other part of the amount is what we call punitive. So damages is just paying you back for expenses that you have made because of this injury, or because of money that you have lost because you haven't been able to go to work. The other part of this is punitive, and in the lawsuit you may say, yes, I want money for all these things that I've lost, my medical bills, the time that I wasn't able to earn a living. But on top of that, I also want to punish you because you shouldn't have spread cooking oil all over the floor in your grocery store. You should have known better than that. That second part is what we call punitive. That is going to be taxable. But the damages part of it is not going to be. Specific employee benefits. I put this in here because this is where it's at in order of your book. If you've noticed, I've been going in order that the book has. We're going to come back to that in a minute because that's a pretty big category. Right now I want to jump on over to the next one, which is taxes that have been paid abroad on foreign earned income. You may have business dealings in Ireland, and the business in Ireland has made you money. It's foreign earned income. Well, the IRS says as long as you pay taxes in Ireland on the money that you earned in Ireland, you still have to report in the U.S. that you made that money, but we're going to let you exclude it out of your taxes because you've already paid the taxes over there. Income from what's called discharge of a debt. If you file bankruptcy, that means that you are better off financially than you were before you went into bankruptcy. So the amount of debt that you've had discharged that you don't have to pay is not included in your earnings. It's excluded. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, though, is If you work out a deal with your landlord because your donut shop is really behind on the rent that you pay to your landlord, so your landlord says, you know what, I'll cut what you owe me in half if you can just get caught up and stay current going forward. That amount is taxable. That's not through a bankruptcy. You'll see on the screen that I've got the word gifts up here. That's the other thing I want you to go back and look at whenever you're going through this part of the chapter, is there is some tie-ins here between money that might be owed that someone says, oh, don't worry about it, you don't have to pay me back, and a gift. So make sure that you understand the relationship between gifts and between people saying, no, don't worry about it, don't pay me back. Next one up is what we call gains from small business stock. Make sure and read this in your book. It deals with C corporations that are set up for very small businesses. So if you invest in one of those very small businesses that's incorporated as a C Corp, and you make gains on whatever it is that you've invested, that's going to be excluded from your earnings. And quite honestly, there are other specific exclusions. The IRS has the ability to look at pretty much anything that you want to appeal and say this shouldn't be considered earning. So they can look at it and say, okay, you're right, it's not. Is there a great big catalog of those? Maybe somewhere, but anytime you're going to be dealing with something that gets this specific, you're going to be in touch with the IRS to talk to them about it to see. So don't worry about learning that. Just understand that there are other specific things that fall into this category that are too small to actually get into in this class. Now, I want to go back to the page before. I told you that we were going to get into employee benefits. And before we dig into that, let's take a break in this video, pick it up in the next one, and we'll dig through what the employee benefits are.